In this project, I'm trying to think through the conditions through which private regulations around net zero might lead to better public regulations around net zero. So the inspiration for this is rooted in four stylized facts. One, we've seen a lot of net zero targets from companies in the recent years. Two, these targets vary hugely in quality. Three, we've seen a lot of standard setters coming forward to try to provide some rules around these kinds of targets, especially the UN, NGOs, International Organization for Standardization, etc. And finally, fourth, we see a lot of governments now stepping in to regulate different aspects of companies' alignment to net zero. And this happens in the realm of disclosure, or in procurement rules, or in transition plans, or other areas. And to cite this one example, disclosure of climate-related risks and information began as a project 20 years ago by NGOs. It was then orchestrated through the G20. There's something called the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. And now governments and jurisdictions accounting for over half of the world economy have some kind of mandatory rule in place around climate disclosure. And if the United States goes along, that'll be more like 2/3. So this has gone along this, what I use the metaphor of a kind of conveyor belt from the private to the public. And the question is, how can we make that more effective? Because obviously, if we want to think about bringing up the whole universe of net zero standards, we need to go from voluntary rules to mandatory rules at some point. But of course, private rules may not be high quality, and public rules and outcomes may not be high quality either. And so thinking through this interaction effect is really important. So to do that, I try to turn back to some of the big body of literature around private and public regulation and the interaction between the two. And I think there are three kind of modes that literature draws on mostly. Here I'm thinking about work by Jessica Green and Ken Abbott and Declan Seidel. So entrepreneurial governance, Jessica says, is the way that private actors create rules that then public actors or others may adhere to. Delegated, of course, is when public actors give private actors certain responsibilities and governance functions. And orchestration is when public actors try to steer private actors toward their goals. The analytic move I try to make in the memo is to think about how those three different modes of governance and the interaction between public and private governance change based on the alignment or lack thereof between public and private actors. So obviously when public and private actors both align, each of these three modes has a role to play, and indeed we see lots of examples of that providing a kind of positive feedback between public and private rulemaking. The more interesting cases, of course, are when when public and private actors don't agree, and in those cases, different kinds of interactions become more important. So, for example, private rulemakers might try to use entrepreneurial techniques to influence or substitute for public rules, and that could be either to strengthen them or to weaken them, or to build them where they're not there, or to try to block them when they might be coming. And public actors can use orchestration in similar ways. And so thinking about this kind of this idea of how interest alignment conditions the nature of these public-private interactions is, I think, really interesting to me. The other part of the framework is to think about how, if you then narrow down the set of interactions to the ones you think are positive, so like the one pro-climate private actors are trying to use private governance to influence or to substitute for recalcitrant public authorities, or when pro-climate public authorities are trying to mobilize or galvanize action by recalcitrant private actors, how can those be combined to try to build up the outcomes that we want to see? And in policy-facing work, I've tried to advance this idea of a conveyor belt to explain and demonstrate how these kinds of modes of governance might best interact. And a lot of that logic lies in the idea of catalyzing communities of leaders who then can change the conditions under which other actors might follow, following this catalytic cooperation idea that I've written about. And here I'm trying to think through those mechanisms and see where they apply and where they don't apply in the regulatory space. So the final thing I'd love to do in the project is to think more about the theoretical implications. And my gut feeling, and it's really just that at this stage, is that the nature of private governance around net zero in particular, but climate change more broadly, is in some ways quite different from some of the previous episodes we've seen, where kind of Forest Stewardship Council or Marine Stewardship Council or the sweatshop rules, kind of 1990s era voluntary standards were about solving market externalities through market-based tools, and never achieved a really, what you might say is a transformational change. It seems this climate-focused stuff is quite different, and that's trying to really reshape the economy overall. And so I think there's something interesting and theoretical there to unpack, and that's what I'm hoping to discuss when we meet.